Okay. Okay. So, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming back to our colloquium. And we are very glad to have here Baruch Barzel from the Department of Mathematics, just on the other side. Very cross, yeah. So Baruch did his PhD in the Hebrew University of Herbia in 2010, and he then moved to Boston, where he was in the lab of Barabasi, who is the headmaster of network. And it turns out that the headmaster needs good people to actually.
Shlomo was the headmaster.
Okay, I don't know. So
Shlomo is the president. He's the pope.
So it turns out that a good headmaster needs actually physicists to actually do the job, and Baruch is definitely one of them. And he published a huge number of high-profile publications. He organized one of the main conferences in network physics here in Israel, and recently he was in Venice. Actually, he came back here just a couple of days ago from Venice. He was a keynote speaker at the network, the conference of network physics. But I don't want to steal any more time from your time, so you already have 2 minutes less, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, Emmanuel.
No.
Almost. No.
No?
No.
No?
It is very good. Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Thank you for coming. I have to say that after this introduction, I can't wait to hear what I have to say. Also, regarding the fact that we started 2 minutes late, from my experience, it only matters if the talk ends on time, not if it starts on time. And I promise to do that. Our story begins in the summer of 2003. There was a local failure in South Canada that propagated to become one of the largest blackouts in history. Now, this, of course, demonstrates for us the potential vulnerability of our critical infrastructure, but more broadly, it illustrates the crucial role that networks play in many of our modern scientific challenges. from the functionality of the brain to the interactions within the cell, of course, the resilience of our critical infrastructure, and finally, no less important these days, of course, the spread of epidemics on social networks. And with this motivation at hand, for the past 23 years, ever since the turn, 25 years, ever since the turn of the century, we, and by we I don't mean myself, I mean the network science community, have been studying the structure of all of these complex biological, social, and technological networks. And let me just tell you about two characteristics that we find across the board. The first thing is that, as physicists, we're very much used to look at particle systems, and they're typically on a very organized, well-ordered lattice. They have symmetric interactions. They are in a 2 or 3-dimensional organization, and they're rather standard. That means, for example, in this lattice, every node has exactly k equals 6 neighbors. Networks are way more complicated than that. They're disordered, they're weighted, so not all interactions are the same. And what's very important for us, and this is what I want you to focus on, is that they are extremely heterogeneous. If we look at the environment that every node observes around it, well, here each particle sees the same number of neighbors. Networks are scale-free, and I'll try to illustrate that in a second. It means that the number of neighbors that a node sees can span orders of magnitude. There's no typical node. Every node sees a different environment around it. Now, for many of you, the term scale-free, you're well-versed, you're experienced, but for the students who might have not got the grasp of what it actually means, I want to focus on the idea of the scale-free phenomenon and use a very simple illustration to try to understand it. Think about the height distribution. So the average person, say male, is about 1.80 m, maybe 1.70 m. That's the average person. And then there's some level of variability around that because some of us are taller, some of us are shorter, some of us are thinner or fatter. But let's face it, we can all, despite our differences, sit on the same chairs. And that is because human beings have a typical scale. When we look at the number of neighbors of a node in a biological network, for example, how many interactions does a specific gene have? Or in a social network, how many friends does a specific person have on Facebook? Or in a technological network, how many connections does a router have to other routers around it? We find a completely different distribution. The vast majority of nodes have a very small amount of neighbors. And then there are nodes that are 10 times more connected than average, 100 times more connected than average, or even 1,000 times more connected than average. To put this in perspective, encountering a gene or a protein that is 1,000 times more connected than the average is like walking around campus and meeting a person who's 2 kilometers tall. Now you tell me, where is she going to sit here? So networks do not have a typical scale. So this was all about the structure of complex networks. And here's the challenge. You see, I like to think about structure of a network as a static roadmap. And the problem is that we all know that the same roadmap has very different traffic patterns at 8 a.m. in the morning or at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. Now this, of course, it's a metaphor. I know this is not physics, but the metaphor comes to illustrate the fact that identical networks may give rise to fundamentally different dynamic behaviors. The road has not changed between 8 a.m. and 2 p.m., but the traffic patterns have changed dramatically. So how do we leverage... Oh, I forgot that there are people here who are detail-oriented. It's a different angle on the same highway, I think.
No. One's San Clemente and one's El Centro. They're different parts of California.
When I ever try to navigate, this is my experience whenever I go driving. It seems to me like they actually changed all the highways from the last time I drove on the road. Well, anyway, how do we take 25 years of understanding into the structure of complex networks and leverage that to actually understand, predict, and ultimately also influence or control their dynamic behavior? Well, of course, to do this, we need to add another layer of description, because when we talk about a network, we have a bunch of nodes. They can be proteins or individuals or routers in the internet, and they're connected by links. But we need to ask ourselves, what is the meaning of a link? Behind the link, there is a mechanistic interaction. When I say that node 1 is linked to node 2, does that mean that node 1 pollinates node 2, like in an ecological system? Maybe node 1 transmits a virus to node 2, like in a social network with epidemic spreading. Or maybe node 1 chemically binds to node 2, like what happens between proteins in the cell. So these different interaction mechanisms are captured by what I call the general equation. It's not the most general thing you can think of, but it is pretty general. And it goes like that. You see, every node has a dynamic activity, xi of t. The meaning of that activity depends on context. It can be the concentration level of a protein, the instantaneous load on a power grid component, or the probability that an individual is infected with COVID-19. And when we track the dynamic behavior of these activities, well, they follow an equation with two terms. The first term, M0, is the self-dynamics. Forget about interactions. Forget about the network. Put a protein in the middle of the room. What is it going to do? Reproduce, degrade, give birth to another protein. There is an internal self-dynamical mechanism of every node that is captured by the function M0. And then the second term is a sum over all the interactions, where the function M captures the mechanism of that interaction. One of the three that I've shown here, for example, or many others that you can think of. So in my view, when I think about a complex network dynamical system, you have a question?
Yeah. Is
Yeah,
it
sure.
usually linear or?
Definitely nonlinear. Okay? So in my view, when I think, and this is precisely what I'm going to say now, in my view, when I think of a complex network dynamical system, what I think of is two layers. First of all, there's the lattice structure, Aij, weighted, directed, typically extremely heterogeneous. And on top of that, there are the intrinsic nonlinear interaction mechanisms. So for me, a complex system is a bunch of thousands or millions of coupled nonlinear differential equations. The network is actually the coupling. Which equation is coupled to which other equation?
You assume you're following Newton, I guess, two-body interactions.
Two-body interactions. Yes. This is all
Why
that,
should
this is all
that
that is
be at
allowed here.
all relevant to anything beyond physics?
Well, physics is good enough for this room, right?
No. I mean, okay, unless you delete all the pictures you have here, or like it's not a two. Well, why should it be in general a two-body interaction?
Why is disease spreading not a two-body interaction?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, this is what I can solve. This is what I'm going to show you today. I can only do two-body interactions. More than that is too complicated for me. I need to leave some work for the real smart people. Okay. So
It's not about smart. It's about reality. I mean, is it like this or is it not like that? I mean,
the things that are like this are like that. This is what we
okay.
solve.
So what's like that? I mean,
Well,
you
many
believe
genes
this
and
is,
proteins have two-body interactions. Not every single biological cycle is a two-body interaction. You know what? I'll say something a little bit more. I'll take a step back. Even when it's not two-body interactions, there is insight in looking at the behavior of two-body interactions. This is what I'm going to try to argue. I hope that by the end of the talk, I might convince you on that. So here are some examples of common models that are used in this context. And if you're well versed in nonlinear dynamics, they might look familiar to you. Each one of them comes from a different domain. This, for example, is the classic model of epidemic spreading, that the SIS model that we use to follow the spread of epidemics on social networks. So now we have a mathematical framework, and we need to ask ourselves, what is it exactly that we want to predict? Well, the question is, what do networks do? Well, I would argue that whether you're sitting in the dark in a blackout, or whether you're looking at a gene perturbation experiment or at the spread of epidemics on a social network, it's always about the spread of information in the system. Information can spread in the form of overloads, from a local failure until it reaches your home. It can spread in the form of biochemical signals, or it can spread in the form of viruses. But it's always how the network supports the patterns of spread of information. And in physics, we have a very well formulated way to look at this using perturbation experiments. So imagine that your system is at some fixed point. Here's another assumption, okay, that your network is at some fixed point. It is at a specific state. Every node has its equilibrium activity. And then around that state, I make a small perturbation, delta xj. One of the nodes changes its activity, and this instigates a signal. And the signal travels through all the pathways in the system until eventually it evokes a response at a target node xi. And now we can ask a lot of questions about this. We can ask, for example, how much time will it take the signal to reach from the initial perturbation until you sit in the dark at home? Or how or where will the signal be observed at different time points in the system? How strongly will xi respond to that signal? If I responds dramatically to the J signal, they're very well connected, dynamically speaking. If I only has a very small response, then even if they're connected by the network, they are dynamically kind of not disconnected from each other. The last question is kind of more cryptic. How the signals spread? I'm going to have some time. I'm going to talk about these two questions. When and how. So let's start with the question when, and I want to start phenomenologically. So what you see here is we took a scale-free network, the same scale-free network, and we implemented 6 different dynamical models on that network. For example, a gene regulation model, a neuronal dynamical model, protein interactions, plant pollinator interactions, different dynamical mechanisms on the exact same network. And at time t equals 0, we instigated our signal right here at the node at the center. Same node every time. And we track the patterns of spread. Now I know what you're thinking. Well, you put a signal on a node, and then the neighbors respond, and the neighbors of the neighbors respond, and that's how things propagate in a network. And this kind of intuition seems to work well in, yeah, sure, sorry. Yeah.
So you mentioned this equilibrium state that you assume the network is in, but finding that state is very difficult. So what do you assume here for the equilibrium state?
The network is founded for me. We are around the equilibrium state of the network.
So you know how it's. Like you take it from some given.
I'm assuming that my network is at an equilibrium state. It has been evolving for some time and reached an equilibrium state. And then around that state, I look at its response to small perturbations.
Yeah, but if I would just take a state and evolve it in time, it would have dynamics in this, unless it's really at its equilibrium state. How do you know the equilibrium state? That's a difficult question.
I agree it's a difficult question. So let's assume that I solved that question.
Doesn't change in time.
Let's assume that I solved that question. The network solved it for me. I mean, in another talk, I might discuss how to find that equilibrium state, but that's not what right now, I'm assuming that I found my network, it's at an equilibrium state, and around that equilibrium state, I'm looking at its response patterns to local perturbations and how information spreads in the system. Going back to where we were before the question, so our intuition about how things spread seems to work pretty well here in the blue dynamics. You see, roughly speaking, the signal spreads from the center outwards, how we would expect it to work. But then on the same network, same layout, nothing has changed, same perturbation, I just changed the nonlinear dynamics, and we see completely, visibly different pattern of spread. In fact, here, if you look carefully, it might seem that the signal, first of all, evoked an impact on the outskirts of the network, and then it propagated inward, which is a very counterintuitive form of propagation. In fact, let's look at 2 specific nodes. It's kind of hard to see, so let's focus on them. The gray node and the black node, same 2 nodes. I'm looking at 2 specific nodes. And in the red dynamics, same network, same signal, same nodes, it seems that gray received the signal before black. But then on the green dynamics, actually black is the one that received the signal before gray. So even the sequence of responses, which node receives the signal first, which node receives the signal later, is not predictable by just looking at network structure. Finally, the timescales of the propagation range over 6 orders of magnitude despite using the same network. So the one take-home message, and for the people who are asking difficult questions, this take-home message may not surprise you, but for all the rest, the one take-home message here is that we have bad news. That network structure is simply not enough to predict its dynamic behavior. You need to really understand how the structure interplays with the system's nonlinear dynamics. And to present a solution to this problem, I want you to forget for a second about the network. No network, just 2 nodes. J, the source of the perturbation, which sends a signal to its direct neighbor I. Just these 2 nodes. When I receives the signal, it doesn't respond instantaneously. It takes it some time to understand, oh my God, J has been perturbed. I need to change my own activity. So I has a typical response time. And what we can show is that tau I, the node's response time to an incoming signal, scales with that node's weighted degree ki to the power theta. Now I see your faces. None of you are excited, okay? So let's try to get you excited about this. Why should we care about the scaling relationship? Well, the first reason we should care about the scaling relationship is because as physicists, we see that there's a universal scaling relationship. That means what seemed to have been diverse and unpredictable actually has underlying rules. There is some order in this chaos. And now the colors also make sense. For example, the blue dynamics, they belong to the theta equals 0. Sorry. They belong, Emmanuel warned me that I'm going to get in trouble with this pointer. They belong to the theta equals 0 universality class. Whereas the red dynamics, they belong to theta equals 3/2 and theta equals 1. The green dynamics, two very different systems. One of them is epidemic spreading, the other one is plant-pollinator relationships, two completely different systems from different domains. Well, they belong to the same box, the theta equals -1 universality. So behind the seemingly diverse and unpredictable behavior, there is an underlying rule, a universal scaling relationship. But how can we use this scaling
So
relationship?
in all these examples, that you have the same alpha. The degree distribution is the same in all of them.
Every one of these examples is run on many different networks. You can see that we have many different lines. Some of them are
So-
empirical networks, some of them are model networks.
What is the alpha for these networks?
Could be 2,
So
2.5,
theta doesn't
3.
depend on alpha. Or
Theta doesn't depend on the structure of the system. It only depends on the dynamics. That's precisely the point. Okay? Just to keep in mind, the actual scaling you're going to observe will depend. If you have broad degree distribution or a narrow degree distribution, you'll see different phenomena. But the scaling relationship, that's a pattern. That pattern that tau I scales like ki to theta, how your response time scales with degree, that is a universal feature of every one of our dynamical systems.
Just to understand, K is the connectivity of the node,
Yeah, degree. The way
the degree of the node.
Yeah.
Okay? So, I mean, we gave an example from 2 nodes in the last slide.
Yeah, that was cheap.
Ah.
It was 2 nodes, but they remember that they have other neighbors. I just didn't draw the other neighbors.
But I mean, can you give us an intuitive argument why should the response time depend on the connectivity of the node?
Well, if you have 100 neighbors and I have only 2 neighbors, then it means that your equation has 100 interaction terms. Well, I only have 2 interaction terms in my equation. So naturally, we will have very different behavior. One of the things that comes out of that is that our intrinsic timescales are different. In fact, I would ask, why would they not be different? Why would nodes that have such different equations not have a different timescale?
So you should think about, let's say, this connectivity as some kind of mass or something like that.
You can think about it that way, yeah. You can think about it. So that would give the intuition that if you're very well connected, you're a very slow responder. But if theta is negative, it's the other way around. So think about it as mass is a good starting point, but it's not really mass. Let's get some intuition here, and I know that there's some math that I haven't shown you here, okay? But let's get some intuition on what is the meaning of this result, and not just about what is the technicalities behind it. So I would like to argue that on top of the scaling relationship and the universality, which is something exciting for physicists, let's talk about something exciting for people who want to understand network dynamics. You see, let's look at the scaling relationship. Ki, the blue term, is a node's weighted degree. Remember, we've been mapping this for 25 years. We know the structure of the network. We know where are the hubs and where are the small nodes. So this is a known topological, structural element of the system. Tau I, the orange term, is a node's response time. It's a dynamic function that we would very much like to predict. And theta? Theta is a dynamic determinant. It helps us connect a node's degree, a structural element, into its response time, a dynamic function of interest. So for example, let's go back to our previous example. Imagine that Nadav has 10 times more friends than I have. So Ki for Nadav is 10 times larger than it is for me. But if we are in the theta equals 2 dynamics, it also means that Nadav is 100 times slower than me, because response time scales like K squared. But if, on the other hand, we change the dynamics of the system, and now we're in the theta negative regime, for example, theta equals -2, now Nadav, who is 10 times more connected than I am, is also 100 times faster to respond than I am. Now let's take this insight and put it back into the network. So remember, a metaphor that was shown in slide number 1 is going to come back to bite you 10 minutes later. That's exactly where we are now. Let's think again about our network as a roadmap. And about the signals traveling between the nodes, think about them as cars traveling along the junctions of that road. So in the theta positive regime, the hubs, their time scales are much larger. They are the bottlenecks of this propagation. In this case, the top path from the source to X is going to be way faster than the bottom path from the source to Y, because the hubs are like traffic jams in your system. But then, on the same network, on the same network motif, on the same element, S, X, and Y, these 3 nodes, if we now change our dynamics into something that has theta negative, suddenly the role of the different structural elements changes. And now the bottom path is the freeway, the hubs are the fastest responders, and the top path is what represents the traffic jam. And this gives rise precisely to what we call the network GPS. Because what does a GPS do? It takes a static roadmap and uses the lag time at every junction to create a dynamic roadmap. What is the temporal distance between two locations, not what is the physical distance between two locations. And when we look at it through the lens of theta, suddenly the diverse and unpredictable behaviors we've seen before start to make sense. So we started with this picture over here, but now we can lay out the nodes in a smarter fashion. Just a second, Lonnie. We can lay out the nodes in a smarter fashion. For example, in the red dynamics, we give the hub enriched pathways a longer distance because they're very slow. But then in the green dynamics, theta negative, we do the other way around. We give the hub enriched pathways a small. We can track them because they're very, very fast. And we find that when you lay out your nodes this way, you actually get a very predictable form of propagation, which is what you would expect. It just doesn't look at the network structure. It looks at the network structure through the lens of the scaling relationship of time scales with degree. Yeah, Ron, you wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, the previous slide, could you explain a little bit less abstract theta, a positive theta, how this affects the cats and the mice? So,
I'm trying to get there.
This one.
A positive.
So what is this network actually? A cat is catching a mouse, and I mean, I didn't quite get.
Yeah, it's one of our dynamics.
The bees and the flowers, but.
The bees and the flowers are plant pollinators.
Yes.
The cat and the mouse are prey predators. It's a different dynamical system.
And how? I mean. How
Okay, so in these different
where's
dynamics.
the hub there? I mean.
So a hub is a node that is very highly connected.
No, this I understand.
It can be very, very
This
fast.
is a cat that is very fat and eating more mice? Or?
No, it's an animal that has, in your network, an interaction would mean in that case a cat eats a mouse.
Yes.
Some animals eat only few types of prey. Other animals can eat hundreds of types of prey. Yeah, so it's the number of species that the animal can eat.
But
So K is the in degree or the out degree?
It's the in degree. It's the in degree.
So it's the opposite. It's not how we eat. It's you're eating by.
Who is eating you?
okay.
I need to recall. I
But
don't remember.
Theta is a purely dynamical quantity. It does not depend on the network.
Does not
Right.
depend on the network.
Right. So, and presumably it depends on your MIJs. I mean, in your
Precisely on your M0
Okay,
and
but
M.
it's sorry.
Yes, on your on the nonlinear functions M0 and M.
Okay, but obviously, it since for a given, let's say, situation, there is only one theta. Not for every node you write a different theta.
Yeah.
This means that there is some kind of a invariant or something for the entire
Right.
collection of these MIJs which defines theta. So you know how to calculate this, yes?
In our assumption about the structure of our nonlinear equation,
Yes.
I assume that you can put any nonlinear function you want there, but that once you've chose the nonlinear function, it's the same nonlinear function for all nodes and for all links. That means your system is a epidemic spreading system.
Okay.
So everyone follows epidemic spreading. You can have different parameters. You can have a higher recovery rate than me because you're healthier than I am, but you don't follow a different dynamical system.
I see.
Okay, so the network has a context. Proteins can bind chemically to one another. They cannot transmit diseases to one another. People can transmit diseases. They cannot bind chemically. So your network has a context, and that describes the Hamiltonian of the system. Like the Ising model, you can change parameters or strength of interaction, but the spin to spin interaction is given in the physics of the system. Maybe I didn't emphasize that enough. So your nonlinear mechanisms are part of the physics of your system, and they're the same for all the components. Specific parameters, like how infectious the disease is or how prone you are to get the disease, this can change from node to node. That's fine.
But that's
the
very different from a
mechanisms themselves
But if the
are
AIJ
embedded in the system.
If the AIJs were correlated to the degree, how could this be true? I mean, so you're assuming that the AIJ is statistically independent of the case.
At least approximately statistically independent. Yeah, if you correlate them very strongly with degree, you'll break it down. But you'll need to really. I mean, this is a pretty good approximation.
And if you have a network with two nodes, 10 and with the degree is 10, let's say, and 20, will it have the same thing, the correlation with the time, or
or not?
Just two nodes in your network?
No, not
Okay.
two nodes, two
Right.
types of connections.
Okay, so what would happen if you have two types of competing mechanisms?
No, two types of. Okay, I don't know how you call it.
Yeah, so some of your nodes undergo
These are not
chemical
scale-free. I'm
binding,
just-
and
you said it's not related to scale-free because in general, theta is independent of alpha. So the question is, do you need scale-free at all?
so I'll relate to that, but I'll give you now, just so you can keep listening, I'll give you now the short answer. You don't need to have the network be scale-free for this to be true. You do need the network to be scale-free for this to be meaningful. Because saying that timescales scale with your degree when everyone has roughly the same degree is not that meaningful. But when degrees vary over orders of magnitude, it becomes a defining feature of the system's behavior. Okay, and I'll relate, this is like for the last slide, but since you asked, so I gave you the brief answer now. And for anyone who lost us in this technical discussion here, okay, this is a good time to hop back on the train. Okay, we're going back to the insights that we can extract from this parameter theta. One thing that we can ask ourselves, I mean, this was very microscopic, looking at the actual patterns of propagation in the system for all of the nodes. It's kind of messy. Let's try to get some macroscopic insights. So if networks are scale-free, the common knowledge in network science is that they become very, very well connected. Because think about it, if you have a hub that's connected to a large number of nodes, it's a shortcut. So networks that are scale-free tend to be ultra small. They have very, very short pathways. Everyone can find a shortcut to everyone else through the hubs. Are they also ultra fast? Well, remember, if theta is positive, that means that your hubs are actually the bottlenecks of the system. They slow down the propagation. And what we find is that scale-free networks are actually way slower than networks with the same degree and the same other parameters, but are not scale-free. So the scale-free phenomena makes you slower. But as we change theta from positive to negative, that is changing your dynamic mechanisms, we can go anywhere from being ultra slow, red, to ultra fast, where the hubs are actually freeways that speed up the propagation. And this is a very interesting implication. Think about not how much time it takes a signal to travel from one node to another, but the sweeping time. How much time will it take a signal to cover, say, most of your network? You know, all of your network or half of the nodes in the network. How much time will it take your shout to be heard by everyone in the network? In the ultra slow regime, we can show that this actually leads to a scaling relationship. As the network grows, the time it takes for signal to spread grows polynomially with network size. This is something you would expect from a lattice. So a scale-free network and a lattice, the complete opposites from a structural perspective, actually have similar dynamic behavior if you're in the theta positive regime. At the other end of this, if you're in the theta negative regime, the hubs are shortcuts that actually turn your network to behave like a single node. That means that the timescale for propagation become independent of network size. What you see here in the green plot is networks that range over 4 orders of magnitude. But the amount of time it took for a signal to start from one node and cover the entire network was roughly constant. The top one ranges between 1 to 1.5 time units. So you have 4 orders of magnitude in size, but you don't observe any difference in the time it takes for signals to spread. The network actually is condensed. It behaves almost like a single node. So what do we have here? On the one hand, we have bad news. Same network, the scale-free phenomena, the fact that networks are extremely heterogeneous, has very different dynamic interpretations, all the way down from being ultra slow to being ultra fast. This is supposed to make you sad, because it means that everything we researched about network structure is just not enough. But the happy part, I mean, the good news, is that all of these diverse behaviors boil down to one analytically predictable scaling exponent theta that we can extract directly from the system's dynamics. So on the one hand, we have diversity, but on the other hand, this diversity condenses into clear classes of behavior that can be analytically predictable once you know your system's dynamics. Now, I've shown you just one dynamic determinant. Tau I, the time scale, scales like ki to the power theta. But imagine that we can have many different other determinants. For example, gamma that you see here is the depth of the penetration, how the signals decay exponentially. Do they decay rapidly, or do they persist for large distances in your network? Ci is the cascade sizes. So we have many other dynamic determinants that help us systematically connect network structure into dynamic functions of interest. When you piece together the puzzle, you can get macroscopic insights into how the dynamics helps you translate structure into behavior. So on the one hand, when you introduce dynamics, you get this microscopic diversity. Everything that we've seen about networks, that they're universal, that social, biological, technological networks, very different domains, have similar structures. Everything that we've seen about structure doesn't translate into universality of dynamics. But on the other hand, the dynamics is not all the way out there. This diversity condenses into specific universality classes, each of which has a predictable behavior, a predictable translation of structure into dynamics. Now you want to see another example, I know, so let's go for the next example, which is the one highlighted at the bottom. I call this the flow. So this is about how signals propagate. Let's understand the microscopics of signal propagation. So remember, let's imagine a gene perturbation experiment. On the one, you start with a signal on node N. You measure the response at the target node, the orange node M. But in the middle, what did the 15,000 other genes do? They were not the source of the signal. They were not the target of the signal. They were the pipelines. They were the mediators of the signal. So in fact, most of the time, what a node does in a network, it is not the source of any signal or the target of any signal. Most of the time, we are pipelines. We mediate the spread of signals from one source to another target. So everyone asks about networks, who is the most influential node? Let's ask now, who is the best mediator? Not who is the best source that impacts a large fraction of the network, but who's the best pipeline to reach from source to target. So we can talk about the flow through a node, or we can talk about the flow through a link, or even the flow through an entire pathway. What's the contribution of this pathway to the flow of information in the system? And the way to talk about it is naively to say, okay, let's instigate the signal at the blue node and measure the response at the orange node, once with the green node in the middle, xi, and once without it. But that's not good enough. Why? Because removing a node, if I remove the mediator node, that in and of itself is quite a signal. That will in and of itself constitute a perturbation. So what we really need to do is we need to freeze node I. We need to keep it there, but just artificially in the computer, not allow it to respond to the incoming signal. So what you see here is the original experiment. You made a perturbation dxn, you measure the response at M, and that response was mediated through both the red and the blue pathway. But if I freeze node I, if I don't allow node I to show any response to the incoming signal, then the green and blue pathways are blocked. And I only see the contribution of the red pathway. The difference between these two pictures helps me quantify the contribution of node I, not as a source, but as a pipeline for signal propagation. And we can do this for all the perturbations, perturb all the nodes in the system, and measure the average contribution of every node or every link or every pathway to the flow in the system. And of course, we find very diverse behavior. For example, sometimes we find democratic networks, where all nodes kind of contribute similarly to the flow. This is a homogeneous flow pattern. All the nodes, the red ones that are highlighted, they all participate roughly equally in their contribution to the flow. But in other times, we find that only a very small selected group of nodes dominates the flow through the system. They are the main pipelines of flow in the network. This may not be surprising. You think they might be the hubs, right? But C also had hubs, and they were not expressed in the flow patterns of the system.
So this depends on both the structure and the dynamics of
course,
network.
yes. Everything here depends on both structure and dynamics. The question is how. And you know the drill by now. There's universality behind this seeming diversity. The flow through a node scales with that node's out degree and in degree with an exponent of omega, which comes from the dynamics. The flow through a link is a little bit more convoluted, but you don't need to focus on the details here. The point is, once again, that we take a structural characteristic of the system. That's the blue terms, the in and out weighted degrees. We look at a dynamic function of interest. That is the orange terms, the flow through a node or the flow through a link, and we can map them through dynamic determinants, in this case the exponents omega and psi. here's what you see. All of the diversity you see on the top left actually collapses into one universal curve. On the x-axis, our predicted equation. On the y-axis, our actual observation of the flow. And all of the data you see on the top collapses onto this one curve. This curve is what predicts the flow. And notice, sometimes the hubs are on the top of the curve. Sometimes the hubs are on the bottom of the curve, all depending on the dynamic determinants, omega and psi. I think I saw a question in the back.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand what's the difference between blocking a node from responding and between removing it completely.
Removing a node, the node has some activity, has a steady state activity.
Even
And
if it doesn't respond to anything?
even if it doesn't respond to anything, the system is at a fixed point. If you remove a node, it's like essentially changing its steady state activity from what it was to zero.
Why?
Because this activity constantly feeds into its neighbors. When something is at steady state, it means that it's at an equilibrium point. But that node, constantly, its activity is constantly feeding into the activity of its neighbors in a way that is balanced. Then you introduce a perturbation, and it changes, and then it changes its neighbors too. But removing that node is like changing that node's activity to zero. That is a pretty big signal to introduce into the system. So we need to freeze the node. But if you lost me on the removal versus freezing, that is not the crucial point here, okay? Here's the crucial point here, and here's where I want to get some insight. Because this, okay, so I mean, this is encouraging. The theoretical prediction seems to work pretty nice versus the simulations. But what is the insight that we can get here on network behavior? Yeah, Ronnie?
What is this threshold flow there that you show on the x-axis?
Theory, not threshold.
Ah, it's in theory.
X-axis, theoretical prediction. Y-axis, what we actually observe. If you lost me on some detail, I need you focused now, okay? So imagine that you have an undirected network. So let's make everything quite simple. In this case, the complicated equations I've shown you before actually condense into a very simple, and after I'll walk you through it, intuitive prediction. We find that the types of flow that your network can feature fall into three general classes. The first class is the red class. It's hub-centric flow. I think this is the one that most of you would have intuitively thought about. That the main contributors of information flow in the system are the hubs. Most of the information, it's an 80-20 rule, like a Pareto rule. The vast majority of information is channeled through a small number of very, very high degree nodes. That is the red dynamics. But then there is a case where we have egalitarian dynamics. For several types of mechanisms, despite the fact that the network structure is scale-free, its flow patterns, the dynamic flow of information, is actually pretty democratic and it's homogeneous. So you have a divorce between network structure and its actual observed dynamics. And the last class, this is the most counterintuitive, is what we call peripheral flow. And here information actually favors the peripheral, longer pathways that walk through the small nodes and tends to avoid the hubs. Now, why? What is the intuition behind that? So I want you to forget about math for a second and just think about the practicality of signal propagation. How does a node contribute to the flow? This is the difference between being a source of information and being a pipeline of information. For a node to contribute to the flow, it needs to respond to an incoming signal, and then after it responds, it propagates the signal onwards to its neighbors. If you want to be a good mediator, it's not enough to be a good influencer on your neighbors. You need to also be very responsive. And in the blue case, it all comes down to the balance between how responsive you are and how influential you are. In the blue case, the hubs are the shock absorbers. They have the high mass. They simply don't respond to incoming signals, and therefore the main contributors to mediation are actually the peripheral nodes. The role of this I'm going to illustrate in a second in an example, but the idea is this: you walk into a party and you see this person who has 1,000 friends, and you think, oh, if I'm going to spread some rumor in this party about my new paper that just got published, I need to whisper on her ear. She's going to spread it for me. Problem is, 999 other nodes are also whispering on her ear. She's just not listening. Okay? My life story on parties, but that's a different question. Okay, so the idea of peripheral flow is that sometimes the hubs are not the main contributors to the flow. They're actually the shock absorbers where signals just get absorbed and they don't generate any significant response. Let's see an example like that. So here we have a very well mapped mini network of glycolysis. It comes from metabolic networks. This one for you, Eli, includes also higher order interactions. So we can only do this numerically. I can't do this analytically, but we find some interesting insight. It takes glucose, which is what you just got from eating cakes, and turns it into ATP, into energy. And it does that through a sequence of biochemical reactions, and we can map them into an equation, and since the parameters and the mapping of this is very well known, we can create numerical experiments on this system. And what we did is we perturbed your glucose intake and looked at the response in your ATP output while silencing or freezing different modules of this chemical sequence. And we find something that at first glance really surprised us. We find that if we look at all the modules, some of them have a net positive contribution to the flow. It means that the output of the ATP was more influenced by changes to glucose when we activated these modules. But other modules, when we froze them, the flow just became better. So they had a net negative contribution to the flow. So some of your nodes, in this case, some of your modules, they don't contribute to the flow at all. They do the other thing or the other way around. They actually buffer that flow. They hinder the flow. But the one thing that struck us is that if we look at the average flow through a node or the average flow through a reaction, it is almost zero. It sums up to zero. And that gives you insight about what networks are really about. I mean, what is a biological system? A biological system is a system that takes intake from this environment. Those are perturbations. You eat lunch, you get a boost of glucose. You manage to hunt an antelope today after a week of going on an empty stomach. You get a boost of glucose. But your output is something that you want to be very, very well regulated. So is the network, why do we need all this complexity? Why do we need scale-free networks? Why do we need such a complicated glycolysis pattern of interactions? We can translate glucose into ATP with a simpler set of interactions. Why do we need this specific set of interactions? Not because it's meant to propagate information. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe a good biological network is something that buffers information. It's a shock absorber. Because your inputs are constantly fluctuating, but you want to guard several outputs to remain untouched. So what networks do sometimes is not enhance flow. They don't contribute to the flow of information. They give you a net zero flow. They're stabilizers so that they buffer all these external fluctuations to make sure that your ATP output is almost, not completely, but almost independent of the pattern, of the fluctuative patterns of your glucose input. So a net zero flow in that sense is actually good news for the functionality of a biological system.
Okay, so if somebody is stupid, this means it's simply very well buffered.
You said that. The last thing I want to talk to you
5
about,
minutes,
and it will take me exactly 5 minutes. So if you, I know that the word 5 minutes is so when I teach courses and I see that people are getting tired, I mention the word exam, or I say, okay, in the last 5 minutes, doesn't matter if there are like 20 minutes left for the talk. It doesn't. I say 5 minutes and everyone wakes up. So this is a good place to wake up. This is the last thing I want to talk to you about. I'm going to do it very, very high level. How do we influence the behavior of our system? So we talked about the equilibrium points, but the equilibrium points can change. The same system can have different equilibrium points. So a common thing that we observe in networks is that it has a good state, say x1, the green state, and say a bad state, x0, good or bad, is a matter of opinion. And you start perturbing the system. You remove links, you remove nodes, and the state changes, responds to that, but nothing dramatic happens. But then at some point you remove the straw that broke the camel's back, and the system transitions abruptly from one state, in this case the green state, to the red state, the bad state. And you want to revive your system, so what do? You say, okay, I'll put the links in. And this work, you can blame Amir Bashan, he's a collaborator. All the questions go to Amir later on this work. And so you start retrieving the lost nodes, retrieving the lost links, but of course, the system doesn't spontaneously rise back. The red state stays stable, and you don't get the system reviving. What do you need to do? You need to actually intervene dynamically. You need to remove the system to put the states of the system back in the green zone so that it can stay there. And last week we celebrated Tu B'Shvat, which is precisely the point of Tu B'Shvat, right? You want to take a desert and we want to make the desert bloom. And we do it one tree at a time. But on real networks, we rarely have this level of control. I mean, I cannot control the state of every single node in the system to put it back in the green zone to make sure that it's reignited. So how do we reignite the system? So we ask ourselves, can you reignite the system by controlling just a microscopic set of nodes, maybe just one node? And we found that there is a new phase. The first phase is the inactive phase, where your system is failed, and there's nothing to do about it. It's going to fail. You can revive it, but it's going to fail back. Just the good state is just not accessible when you're in the red state. Then there's the unrecoverable state. You pull up one node, and it has a local impact and affect its neighbors and its next neighbors. But when you let it go, it falls back into the previous state. You cannot revive the system with a microscopic interaction. But in the recoverable phase, you can reignite the system by pulling on just one node. It will revive its neighbors, and they will revive their neighbors, and their next neighbors, and their neighbors' neighbors, and the whole system will come back to life by controlling just a single node. And of course, once it's back to life, you don't need to control it anymore. You can just let it go. And there are two important insights here. I mean, you can ask, how can we do this wizardry? I mean, it looks like a magic trick, right? How can we do this magic? Well, for people who are old enough, you remember this uncle who knew how to fix the TV by hitting it. And if you're not that old, then you can think about a defibrillator. You take a person who is comatose, and you put some shocks. I've never seen it work in real life, but it does work in the movie, so it must be true. You put some shocks, and then they come back to life. Now, a living person or an operating TV is a very intricate system. You have to balance the genes and the proteins and the different organs, and they all have to act in unison. How come you can just kick the system or shock the system and it transitions back to life? The answer is that it was never your uncle that fixed the TV, or it's not the defibrillator that pumps you back to life. It's you. It's the person. It's the TV that fixed itself. You see, when you buy a nonlinear dynamical system at the grocery store, you open the box, and the different states, the good state and the bad state, are in the box. They come, they are part of the system, they are ingrained, they are programmed, hardwired into the system. All you need to do is kick the system sufficiently strong enough so that you pushed it from one base into another, but then the system will find the functional state on its own. And if we ever have any chance of controlling complex systems, social systems, biological systems, it's through interventions like that. We can never have detailed control of the state of the system. We need to use the hardwired functional states of the system and just do very simple interventions, in this case one node or two nodes, that will help the system navigate itself into the functional state, just like your TV fixed itself, not your uncle. The last insight that I want to give you, and this will really take just 1 minute, is one of the holy grail questions in network science is, why are networks really scale-free? It's a very universal observation. Many networks in many different domains are scale-free, and the question why has different meanings. I mean, you can ask mechanistically why, and that problem is pretty much solved. We have the Barabashi-Albert model, which explains how scale-freeness can naturally emerge without any external planning. Okay. Another question of why is from a purpose point of view. What is it good for? Why does scale-freeness contribute anything to the functionality of a network? And one of the big ideas on this comes from here, actually. Reuven Cohen and Shlomo Havlin, in a paper which you should be proud, because it's one of the foundational papers in network science, 20 years ago have shown that when a network is scale-free, it becomes very robust. You can remove nodes, you can remove links, but it's very hard to break it apart. But this is a structural solution. We're interested in dynamics. How does scale-freeness contribute to the dynamic behavior of the network? And it has to do with many of the questions that I received here, because people who do nonlinear dynamics, they know that you change a parameter, you increase temperature, you change a weight, and the whole system can respond very, very diversely to that. So nonlinear dynamics tend to be very sensitive. What we have found is that almost everything of our predictions is given in terms of a scaling relationship with degree. So that means that when your degrees are diverse, the network features an asymptotic behavior. So homogeneous networks, they also have these scaling relationships, but it's just meaningless. What is the meaningfulness of having your time scale with your degree when everyone has roughly the same degree? So everyone has roughly the same time scales. And small parameters, microscopic changes to the system can change the time scales, can change the behavior, can change the stability of your system. But when your network becomes scale-free, These asymptotic scaling relationships, they dominate over anything else. It doesn't matter now that you change the recovery rate or give it a medicine or use the different disease or change the rate of degradation of specific protein. All this is overridden by the fact that the hubs have an asymptotic behavior which controls the behavior of the system. So asymptotic dynamics, which is what allows these universality classes, this lack of sensitivity to microscopic parameters, are enabled by having degree heterogeneity, by having hubs scale over orders of magnitude. So if time scales scale like ki to the theta, your hubs are going to be bottlenecks even if you change the temperature or even if you add some salt to your system. It doesn't matter because all of these are marginal as compared to the fact that you have a scaling relationship which asymptotically overrides all of the microscopic details of the system. So scale freeness is actually a source. Degree heterogeneity, the fact that networks are extremely diverse, in conjunction with nonlinear dynamics. Both of them seem like very bad news from a theoretical perspective. They are actually good news. They are an organizing principle that allows these systems to behave robustly and not chaotically. They bring order out of chaos. I just want to finish by thanking my team members, my group. They actually do all the heavy lifting, and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Baruch, for being perfectly on time. So we had a few questions, but we still have time for a few more. So Yitzhak, please.
Yeah, so, I mean, is there a deep reason why you use this kind of dynamics which is first order in time? Let's say, like rate equations. You could use, whatever you want in principle.
Like the fact that it has dx dt equals
Exactly.
something.
So, for instance, why not like Newton's second order or something third order or anything else? I mean, this presumably will give you very different results. And for arbitrary systems, I don't know what to use.
I agree. For most of these systems, first of all, I agree. And there are some of our results would actually be very beautiful on a second order, like a d squared x dt squared. For
Because
many of
delay.
these systems, because then you get oscillations
Delay,
and
yes.
all sorts of cool stuff. And imagine not different timescales, but different oscillating timescales that scan
Yes.
over orders of magnitude. That would be beautiful to see. For many of these systems, I could not find a motivation to introduce, like Newton's law.
Well,
So
that's-
power systems have that because really they're like classical physics, but they're not scale-free typically. So
But you're somehow separating the network structure from the dynamics. So dynamics in principle could be totally independent.
yeah, if I'm okay. So some people say you need to be more practical. Your dynamics are too theoretical. You say, come on, dream big, introduce second order.
I'm not just
interactions.
asking whether there is a deep reason or this was just saying, okay, we know how rate equations work, so let's assume it's
No,
like that.
for most of these models, it doesn't seem relevant to introduce a second derivative. It's not diffusion. It's like
So it
it's
has been
how-
explored.
so it is diffusion actually. Oh, you know what? Think about this equation. It's nonlinear diffusion. So there's a first derivative on time, not a second derivative on time. These systems are not Newtonian. They're not. I mean, they don't really follow Newton's dynamics.
Time reversal. Okay, thank
Let's
you.
put it this way: we can do this with
Yes,
the second
yeah.
derivative. It's a matter of motivation. If you convince me there is, I'll be very happy.
Yeah, there's a question.
In the typical examples you took, the theta assumed integer and half integer values. Is it the case with all the dynamical systems, or it was very specific or determined?
So the fact that theta is like a fraction, like 3/2 or 1. Okay, so what goes into theta is basically, you don't need to follow all the details here, but what goes into theta is basically a series of this form. And gamma n can be any exponents you can think of. So you can put like 0.2 or the square root of 2, or you can be completely crazy with this. So theta can be a real number. In most relevant models, the powers are typically whole numbers or fractional numbers. So you get theta, which is like 1, 3/2. It would be very arbitrary to.
We
to
like the
okay.
equation.
This is a good hint, right? In Shabbat we do this. We make sure that the lights are out.
No.
And we want the
No.
guests to leave.
לא, בטח אמרת מצג, אתה אמרת שקט. סוף המצג, yeah, thank you.
Okay. See, now I can be a real professor.
Okay.
Yeah, I get in trouble with my PowerPoint. That's like, yeah. So you can have theta equals the square root of 2 or pi also, but you would have to assume a very peculiar choice of model.
I think Nadav had a question?
In contact with this question, is there any simple explanation why the time is parallel in the number of links and not, exponential or logarithm or anything else?
Okay, so when theta equals 0, it is actually some other form. Theta equals 0, it means it becomes independent of degree, and you have a typical time scale for your system up to variations which can be logarithmic in k. But there's no reason to assume that it's going to be that way in general. Just think about it this way: dxi over dt. Let's forget about self-dynamics, even though it's crucial here. Dxi over dt equals the sum of all of your interactions. If your degree is 100 and my degree is 1, you have 100 terms in that equation. I have 1 term in that equation. So naturally, my dynamics is going to be very different than yours. And we can show that it actually scales with degree. But the way it scales, if it's a linear system, it's very simple. It just scales linearly with degree. But if it's a nonlinear system, it can have all sorts of other scalings. In a simple linear system, you would get theta equals 1.
Okay. More questions? Well, I had a question which was how you derive theta, but I think the answer is here.
Yeah, but when you saw the answer, you said, okay, maybe I don't want to know.
No.
It is actually very convoluted. I'll just say one thing because I know people already need to leave. The derivation of theta is a bit convoluted, and it has this cryptic function y of x in it. And what's important is this, the crucial point. And this is something I skipped, and now I can complete it. Eventually, this function, whatever it is a power series. The power series has powers and coefficients. I would argue that the powers are sacred. You cannot change that. It's a part of your dynamics. Like logistic growth has x squared in it, right? Because it's a pairwise competition. The coefficients are where all the mess goes in. That's where the rate constants and parameters and things I don't know about my system, degree correlations, everything you asked about before, they all go into these coefficients. The crucial thing about theta is that it only depends on the powers.
But this is like a Taylor expansion around 0, or why
so
is 0
physicists
so
believe that
important?
there's only Taylor expansion in the world. It's called a Laurent expansion. It includes also real powers and negative powers. It's not
But
Taylor,
then
per
there
se,
could
but-
be many ways to do the same. I mean, the given function, depending on whether you, let's say even Taylor, whether you extend it through around 0, around another point, or...
So these functions are not, I mean, this is very misleading. The steady state is not necessarily 0 at all. But this function is expanded around 0. To get some intuition, what would appear here is x would be 1 over your degree. So in the limit of large degrees, it goes to 0.
Okay, I guess we'll need to discuss
Okay,
more.
this is there is a reason why in this 45-minute talk I didn't include this slide originally. Okay?
Okay, thank you so much, Baruch. And see you all. So the students who registered for lunch, please approach me now. Hi. You are one of them? Okay. So this is your coupon. And do you know? So do you know where? Is it on yes. So this is one for me. So okay. We have a coupon. Can you call or contact secretary? You should have
יום שלישי.
האמת שאני...
היום יום שלישי.
האמת שאני מקווה. בכלל אני פוגש את זה פה בשכונה. יוסי יובל זה לעתים יותר נדירות.
חתם בערוץ המחאה. אז הוא התבסס.
הוא כתב
מבינים, למה לא מבינים? תודה רבה.
יש קטע כזה.
תודה.
הכל כאילו מיליון משקל.
חנוכה, היה כבר ערב פסח. פורים אולי.
רק על התוכניות של חגים.
של חגים רק, כי לא הצלחנו לעשות את זה כל שבוע, זה היה...
בעצם, האם הדגמים, מלא מלא פרמטרים.
אם אתה שואל, זה אומר שלא שמת לב.
אני יודע שהם טובים, יודעים גם למחזר בלי שכל השאר ירגיש.
אני למדתי שאם אתה לא חוזר על אותן בדיחות, אף אחד לא עושה כלום. אני יכול לבוא את ההרצאה הזאת עוד 10 דקות? כאילו קארט פלאנש.
תקשיב.
תודה רבה. תודה.
אתה לא
איך
מחפש
נשמע
מילים,
אותך?
פשוט פותר את הדינמיקה.
אנחנו ניפגש לקפה אחרי האוכל?
כן.
יאללה, אתה...
אולי זה יכול להיות
איפה
המון
נמצא
סטדיס.
אותך?
אז זה שאלה, האם יש... כן, זה שאלה, אני לא יודע.
הוא אמר משהו על סטדיס.
יאללה.
האם יכול להיות שסטדי סטייט הוא גלאס ויש הרבה מאוד
לא
סטדי
בדינמיקות
סטייט?
שאני מסתכל
לא?
עליהן, וגם בדינמיקות שאתה רגיל שכן. אם הרשת תהיה סקייל פרי, אז בגלל שלהאבס יש התנהגות אסימפטוטית,
יאללה, באת? אני כבר פה.
זה חלק מהעניין. אני לא הראיתי איך אני מוצא את הסטדי סטייט, אבל גם הסטדי סטייט יש לו את ההתנהגות האסימפטוטית הזאת. אז גם רשת שאתה יודע, מה זה?
אתה אומר שזה לא באמת בעיה, אבל זה אקזקט? הסטדי סטייט שלו אקזקט? אתה יכול... כאילו...
תחת הנחות מסוימות כמובן.
כאילו מדאיג אותי נגיד למה לא יכול להיות שני סטייט.
בוודאי שיכול להיות סטייט, כן, בוודאי.
אבל יותר.
אז אני צריך לזכור שאני יושב פה בקהילה של פיזיקאים שהם כולם non-linear dynamicists ואני בדרך כלל אף